Okay, I want to thank the Law and Political Economy program at Harvard Law School, and particularly Yochai Benkler and Sanjay Jolly for putting this mini-series together. My name is Janet Halley, and I'm on the regular faculty here, and I'm going to moderate this panel. And I'm going to get out of the way as fast as I can. I'm going to introduce all three people, and then we'll have 15 minutes for each paper. I'll keep time, and then we'll have Q&A. Our first speaker is Hila Shamir to my right, graduated SJD from HLS in 2008. She's a visiting professor here this year, and she and I are teaching gender and political economy, and very relevant to the title of this program, which is Gender and Political Economy, roughly, which I omitted to say, and I apologize about that. And she's a member of the permanent faculty at Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. Yiran Zhang to my immediate left is SJD graduate of this law school from 2022 and is now an assistant professor at the Cornell Industrial Labor Relations School. And to her left is Claudia Torres, who graduated SJD from Harvard Law School in 2023, and is now a fellow at Greater Boston Legal Services, serving low-wage and undocumented clients. Hila, take it away.
Okay, let me just get a little podium for myself. Can you hear me? Okay, I can do it. Here it is. Just knock off my computer. Okay, so this is one. And I need to share screen, right? So share screen. Okay. And okay. So sorry.
Yeah, move a little bit to the left. Okay.
Yeah.
Good?
Yeah. Okay, so hi everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is this working? Yes. So thank you again to Sanjay and Yochai and the LPE at HLS and all of you for coming, and to Janet for her generative talk yesterday and her collaboration on the course we're teaching, which is so much fun, and to my co-panelists. So today, I want to share with you my work on human trafficking, also known to many today as modern slavery. Work I've been doing for the past 20 years, since I was an LLM student here at HLS, but most intensely in the last 5 years, as I was, why is this not working for me? Let's see. Oh, sorry. Let's see if it will work now. No, let's try again. Stop share. Stop share. Let's try. No, it's not working.
Can you put the computer on the podium?
But it's not working with this. It's
It's
not
not working at all.
either. Sorry. Let's do this and do this. Sorry. Try again. Apologies. After years of Zoom, this should all be seamless by now.
Folks who have just come in should feel free to grab food.
Okay, so sorry again. So this is, as I said, work I've been doing for the past 20 years, but most intensely for the last 5 years, as I have been working, leading this research group called TrafLab, Labor Perspectives to Human Trafficking, funded by the European Research Commission. And I want to use human trafficking today as a lens through which to think about the regulation of vulnerable work in the global economy in the intersection of sex, migration, gender, and labor. I want to use human trafficking as a lens through an investigation that identifies the structures that sustain markets of extreme labor exploitation, and to see how regulatory and legislative attempts were shaped by gendered assumptions that undermined, I would like to suggest today, their ability to bring about change. So as a lawyer, let me start with a definition. What is human trafficking? So in recent years, we saw a lot of interest in the last 2 decades, really a lot of interest in the category of human trafficking and new regulatory and legislative attempts to address it. You see several of these here. I will focus today mostly on the definition produced by the first one, the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, and note especially women and children. So the last 2.5 decades witnessed this really growing interest in human trafficking as a legal category in international and national law. And this is after what seemed, at least at the time, as a relatively long period of lack of interest in that in the international community. Because of the first half of the 20th century, there were a bunch of international legal instruments that dealt with human trafficking that didn't have a definition of it, but it really kind of related to the phenomenon of the forced border crossing, or forced border crossing of women and children across borders for the purpose of prostitution. So these were a bunch of legal instruments at the international level and the national level in the first half of the 20th century that many historians today think about as a result of a white slavery moral panic. So something that was really caused by a fear with growing prostitution among European white women that led to that kind of regulation. So this was the first generation of human trafficking instrument. In the early 2000s, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, a UN body, adopted a protocol to an organized crime convention that for the first time really defined what is human trafficking under international law. Now, the negotiations around this protocol ended up being a battleground of different feminist groups. One group saw this as an opportunity to see all prostitution as trafficking. We consider them sometimes as dominance or radical feminists. All prostitution is violence and exploitation. The other group sought to make sure definition covered a wider set of exploitation in other sectors as well, and to leave room for consensual sex work. Following these legal debates that happened around the negotiations around the language of the protocol, we ended up with a definition that is very confusing and vague, but that is being cleared out through legal interpretation throughout the years. Today, after the Palermo Protocol, trafficking is the experience of women and children, but also men, in forced prostitution as well as forced labor, slavery or slavery-like practices, beyond or within borders. Moreover, trafficking is not just about recruitment and transportation, but also harboring and receipt of persons, which means we kind of are bringing employers into the mix here. And finally, the form of coercion deployed is no longer just violence, threats, and fraud, but also the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability. So as you can understand, this makes this a very capacious and sometimes confusing definition, asking kind of what is really the limits of what trafficking is. Trafficking today is identified, so this is the definition, but I'm going to skip it, is identified in many different sectors outside the exploitation in the sex industry. According to the protocol's custodian, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, the UNODC, it's particularly prevalent in the sectors you see here, such as domestic work, construction, agriculture, garment production, and mining. Now, in these different sectors, we look for different indicators to identify trafficking. It is common to say that trafficking is identified when there is a certain bundle of rights violations. Each of these sticks on its own doesn't amount to trafficking, but some of them together suggest a situation where the worker's liberty and freedom is infringed. You don't need all of these for it to be trafficking. You kind of choose a bunch of sticks out of this bundle. So if it's only wage theft, or payment below minimum wage, or even just late payment or non-payment, that won't be trafficking. But what if we add this excessive overtime, high recruitment fees, mobility limitations, passport withholding? Well, maybe then it will pass the seriousness threshold that makes it acknowledged as human trafficking. And this is an issue of a lot of legal interpretation and legal battles in courts. Now, despite the renewed international, national, and civil society commitment to combat trafficking and the generous resources dedicated to it, there is no sign that the number of humans being trafficked decreased over the years. Despite all of this attention, all of this money poured over it, all of this legislation, 168 countries enacted legislation in their internal domestic legislation to criminalize trafficking. And the question that I want to ask is why? Now, of course, I want to premise, to say that we don't really know how many people are victims of trafficking. This is in itself a political struggle to ask what that is. However, the ILO, ILO, International Labour Organization, IOM, International Organization of Migration, and Walk Free Foundation released just a year ago their most recent global estimates for modern slavery. Now, this does not count trafficking per se because of the wide definition, but as you can see, we're talking about 27.6 million people in forced labor, 17.3 in the private sector. This is usually where we think the 17.3 and 6.3 million is usually where we talk about human trafficking. If we take this number of 27.6 million, then only a fraction of it, 0.3%, are actually identified every year, despite these really intense efforts. So I'm going to skip the numbers, but just give you some gendered overview of this. Although we tend to think of trafficking as a female phenomenon, as a gendered, as something that characterizes a female migratory experience, the numbers actually suggest that the large majority of victims of trafficking are men, although they're gendered patterns. So in the sex industry, 4.9 million exploited individuals are women. Yes, thank you. So why this mismatch? I mean, how can we explain the fact that there is so much activity and so little impact? And my argument, and what we have been arguing at TrafLab, is that the reason is because we have been using the wrong tools. And we were using the wrong tools possibly because of gendered assumptions about what trafficking is. So the way trafficking is being addressed around the world today is through what is called the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. Prosecution is through criminalization of trafficking, and you saw 168 countries did that. Prevention is mostly through border control, the prevention of border crossing for vulnerable populations. Often this can be, not often, but sometimes this can be a ban for women from migrating. In some countries, this is how it was interpreted. And finally, a thin layer of human rights protections to identified victims of trafficking. What we're arguing is this deals with the symptoms of trafficking, but not with the root causes. The root causes for human trafficking, we argue, we should understand trafficking as a labor market phenomenon, as an exploitation within the labor market, and therefore the tools that were developed for it are labor tools, and we're calling for a labor approach. By a labor approach, I don't necessarily mean only unionizing and organizing, but really an approach that looks at the bargaining disparities and the bargaining power in the labor market. So the 3 tools that are mostly used, border control, criminal law, and a thin layer of human rights to identify victims, really are premised on the gendered assumption about forced prostitution. These are seen to be the tools for that. These are also arguably problematic tools, but we know of some cases in which this really reduced the sex industry. I don't know if it reduced exploitation, we can ask about that, but made the sex industry smaller. What we're calling for is a labor approach, one that we talk about structural change, that we see victims as agents of change, and would consider legal tools to strengthen the bargaining position of workers. So, how much time do I have? 3 minutes, 2 minutes. What? 2.5. So let me let me just kind of make some observations about the existing legal regime. So the existing legal regime really focuses on a liberal understanding of the labor market that assumes two separate spheres. One sphere, which is what we know as labor, the labor market with decent work, or at least an aspiration for decent work, where there's consent, choice, control of working conditions, and we're regulated through private law and labor and employment law, so social law, and an outside sphere of criminal behavior, right? Everything that is force, fraud, and coercion. A labor approach would call for an understanding that sees a spectrum of vulnerability. There is some exploitation almost everywhere along the spectrum. And what makes individual position on the spectrum, individual vulnerability, is structured through one's bargaining power and exit options and strategies. So if we really understand trafficking as the extreme end of a spectrum and not as two separate worlds, it tells us that in order to deal with trafficking, we really need to understand how exploitation is built up throughout the spectrum. So within a labor approach, we're thinking of various tools to address this. One, of course, would be status. Status causes vulnerability if one is undocumented or under a very restrictive migration regime, then these are elements that cause vulnerability to trafficking. But mobility restrictions, ability to change an employer, is another key element. Debt, how debt is repaid, how it is structured in recruitment and migration industries is a key element. Legal exclusion from protective employment legislation. Isolation, that is sometimes accompanied by certain requirements in visa regimes, such as the requirement to live in the workers and the employer's household. Individualization through prohibition on family creation, community creation, bringing your family over. And finally, just a follow the money idea, that if there is a formal market corporate entity that benefits from it, this structure will not, the predominant structure will not help us see it. So basically what we have been developing is this new framework of tools that are currently just totally traditionally outside the tools of anti-trafficking work. And I think they're kind of mostly enabled, we are able to see them when we rethink the gendered premises of what trafficking is. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. Thank you. It's up there.
You see it in
Yeah,
the...
I can. Can you change the page?
Yes, good. So thank you, and thank you for everybody who made this panel happen. And I'm very honored and also very nervous to come back and present to share my new research project about public long-term home care system in the US. So to give you an idea about what I mean by public long-term home care, we start with this story that I picked up from reading administrative law fair hearing record about home care. So Grace is a 42-year-old Medicaid recipient who's diagnosed with Alzheimer's and a list of symptoms. And under New York law, that she's qualified for Medicaid and nursing home care, so Medicaid should pay for personal assistance to enable her to live inside the home. And she lives with her daughter, who works full-time job, and hires her niece to be the personal assistant. The niece comes every morning, helps her get out of bed, prepares her meal, feed her, encourage her to drink, use bathroom, take shower, and does everything on demand when she's there. And she also stays with Grace just to make sure she doesn't fall, she doesn't wander off the property, she doesn't run into any safety and hazard risks. And she will wait until the daughter comes home, and daughter takes care of Grace during night. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 times nighttime needs, and the daughter takes care of Grace during the weekends. In addition, Grace's grandson sometimes will bring her to doctor appointments and just stay at the house for help. So the question arising out of this is which part of this care network or care arrangement should be paid, regulated, and recognized as work if that's an option on the table? And how can we measure how much value or how much cost the care work generates or has endured, and which part of these costs should go to the state, and which part of it should be a responsibility for the individuals or for the families? And when we think about the boundaries of all this, how can we understand labor, whether this is labor exploitation or this is a form of altruism, underneath what is going on? And the descriptive dimension of my project is how does the state or the status quo state or the status quo Medicaid system address this set of questions, and what does that tell us about the gender and political economy of the public care system in the US in this moment? So to give you a little bit of context, this is not just a personal struggle for Grace and her families, but also a very major question for the political economy of work at large. So home care has been the fastest growing occupation in the US at this moment, and it's already the largest occupational group in large cities. So if we think about future of work, this is a very significant slice of it. And the expansion of this industry has a lot of factors underlying it. One is the demographic changes, people are living longer, and women are entering the paid workforce, thus withdraw from the unpaid family care on a large scale. And the disability justice movement has also made the right to stay in home and stay in community a major cause for individuals with a disability to take health and life decisions really back into their own hands, which is indeed recognized by Supreme Court decision that when conditions permit, they do have a right to stay in home and the state has a duty to enable that. So, so the response from the government is mostly the expansion of the long-term home care programs in the means test and Medicaid programs, and the expansion mostly happened since the 1990s. And there are two implications from this. First, home care is put through under the healthcare system and understood through a medical provision perspective versus a more general social service or life service perspective. Second, this also, since this program is rooted in Medicaid, the means tested program, so this results in a structural integration between public home care and the poverty law, the poor law on a large scale. And most recently, the Medicaid program increasingly having consumer-directed option that enables and encourage patients to hire their own family members and relatives as this paid caregiver. And this is the last extension of it that I'm trying to theorize and unpack in this project. So if we map this economic system onto the family market state, we really see the interdependency among these three basic economic institutions, as well as the very murky, messy boundaries among them. So when we think of the economy in political economy, we very often just put market in the center of it and having family and state in the background. But if we really want to understand the care economy, there is no way to understand all of the three together. So here are two examples in the public long-term home care system. First, public spending, it really accounts for the predominant majority of paid home care in the country right now. If we look at New York State, which is my case study, 83% of paid long-term home care is paid for by Medicaid program. So when the state doesn't pay for it, there is either a lack of financial means or willingness just to pay for home care as a commodity. Second example of this is that for the home care workers who are also relative families, the Department of Labor has issued a regulatory notice saying the Medicaid payment marks the boundary between what is work regulated under Fair Labor Standards Act and under the work law system and what is natural support that just falls outside the legal scope. So when we think of state-market relations in general, we often think of state as a counter-commodification move. But for home care, state is really the institutional forces that transform some of the care work or some of the care workers from the family sphere into what we think of as a labor market. At the same time, it also still continues to rely on as well as enforce a lot of unpaid care or voluntary care that's inside the family. So to show you how this mixture of family, market, state actors actually come together and constructed this system, I introduce you to how public home care works in New York. So there are a lot of actors. This can be overwhelming, but if we follow the money, this is how the money flows. First, this is a federal state system. Both federal and state government funds it. And as part of this privatization of healthcare trend in New York, the state Medicaid program will enroll the recipient in a managed care plan, which is basically a private health insurance company for a fee. Then the health insurance company will send a nurse assessor to see the care recipient and determine how many hours of service they will need to still continue to live in their home. And based on what the nurse assessor evaluates, the insurance company will authorizes a care plan that contains the maximum hour that the insurance company will pay for. And this care plan very much functions as a contract among all these actors about all of the boundary drawings in practice. And then the recipient will bring this care plan either to hire a market care worker or hire a relative. And they will get paid through this chain of money for the hours they worked, but up to the maximum hours authorized by the insurance company. And outside the paid care system, there are also the family member who can or cannot be this paid caregiver, but support and enable this system in all kinds of capacities. So this is how the system works. And to understand how value is generated or how boundaries draw, we really need to understand the incentives or the governance systems that each of these actors are embedded in. So for the federal and state level of this Medicaid system, they are government entities and they're subject to the political accountability. And accountability here is not only to the recipients or the users of the Medicaid system, but also accountability to the public budget. And they're under a perpetual political and fiscal constraint to spend less. And also there is a very systematic suspicion that there's fraud, there's waste in this system. And so their incentive drives them to search for a way to measure or to value care in a way that they can later prove to the auditors and by the federal government that we tried everything to save cost, we tried everything to reduce fraud. And so the political response is to privatize the service and to introduce market actors, thank you, the insurance companies and home care agencies. So they have a market incentive, they have a profit-driven incentive to spend less for care and pay for less care to minimize what is needed in this scenario. And then the third set of actors are both the nurse as well as a lot of professionals running this system, that they really have two hats here. On one side, they respond to the professional ethics and professional trainings in deciding, okay, what is needed to keep this person alive. But at the same time, they are subject to the profit-making incentives to minimize that need by people who send them. And this is the market or state perspective of it, and underneath of it, or in the shadow of how state does it, there's also the micro bargaining happening among the care worker, the unpaid family member, and the care recipients. And they respond both to what the state said, but they also respond to what is needed in that moment. So going back to the story of Grace, if if the niece has reached the end of the paid hours, but the daughter is not home yet, the micro bargaining is that should the niece stay for another 3 hours, even if nobody's paying her to do that? Should daughter cut back hours to be home sooner? Or should everybody just be fine that Grace can be left for 3 hours, even if there's a risk, but maybe she will be out of this? Or should they go back to the state and say, okay, we need to get paid more, even if the state there is a procedure struggle about it. So this is how the family market state come together in how the system operates. If we look at the gender aspect of it, one dimension is the gender of the actors. Every actor, you should presume every actor here are much more women participating in the system than not. And the paid care workers are more feminized and they're in a more economically marginalized status. But so there are a lot of vulnerabilities for the unpaid caregivers in this system. And so that's the big structure picture I'm presenting here. And the descriptive I'm going to show you the descriptive dimension, how this generates boundary drawing, how this generates the definition of work in the Grace's case. So in the current system, how this work is the nurse assessor will come and look at this arrangement and do functional tasks, interviews with the patient, and she will not scrutinize through like, okay, what will make this person live? But she will look at this through a list of tasks come up by the medical professionals in breaking assisted living into functional clinical tasks. And so the nurse will look at this arrangement through this lens of tasks, and the things in red here, like meal preparation, like getting ready for bed, that's a task. So that became a thing that Medicaid could potentially pay for, and the things in blue has like really fade into the sphere of the family or into the sphere of natural support. And the next step that nurse will do is to figure out among the tasks that's healthcare, would anybody do it for free, for voluntarily? And the nurse will find out, okay, the daughter and the grandson can take up some of these tasks for free, and that again become natural support. And what's left on the table has become mandated care plan, and there is a table to calculate how many minutes you would need to do each of these tasks, and that become what state pays for, that becomes what's defined as legal work in this regime. But as you can see, there's still a lot of things happening outside it. So in my last minute, I want to conclude on a more general remark. I think the question of care and social reproduction has really posed some fundamental challenges to how we conceptualize the economy and law and political economy. But gender and political economy literature and the gender political economy movement has been going on for 1 or 2 decades and has more authority on this, really provides a lot of theoretical tools for us to unpack and understand it. So. Is it unshared?
Stop sharing.
Is that the red button? There. Close. And Claudia, yours is showing.
Presentation. Yeah, got it. Okay. So hi everyone, and thanks for making this happen. Thanks for inviting me. I apologize in advance for the disclaimer you are about to see on the screen. It was very important to my employer, Greater Boston Legal Services, and my fellowship sponsors, Equal Justice Works and the DOJ's Office for Victims of Crime, to let you know that they don't think like me. The findings and thoughts I will share in the next few minutes are my own, and so not necessarily represent their views around any discussed substantive issue. That said, hi, my name is Claudia Torres, and today I am building on Janet's lecture yesterday on Hila and Yiran's presentations and on the work of legal realists and critical legal scholars for quite a long time. I want to tell you a story about an independent street sex worker in Mexico City called Gertrudis. I interviewed Gertrudis 4 years ago. She explained that when she arrived on the streets almost 30 years ago, she, as a newcomer, had to endure the attacks of more senior independent sex workers who did not want her to stay on the street. By enduring these attacks, Gertrudis proved herself worthy of the street and claimed her place in the community of independent sex workers. Gertrudis told me the following quote: "Since I've earned my space, I don't allow others to trespass. One might say the street is free, but it is not. Perhaps as independent sex workers we lack a union, a university, a leader, or someone who controls us. But indeed, we have our own set of rules, and we set the rules, and the rules must be respected." I chose Gertrudis' story and quote because they act as a guide through the working experiences of over 45 low-income street sex workers whom I interviewed in Mexico City during a 2-year ethnographic fieldwork. Ethnographic work is a healthy way out to commonsensical assumptions that are deeply ingrained in our legal system, and yet do not say much about people's everyday lives, especially the most marginalized. In particular, my research allowed me to explore the system of informal norms that street sex workers establish in the shadows of the legal order. I use "in the shadows" purposefully because sex workers' informal social norms came to life as foreground, primary codes of conduct for these women, and yet the legal rules were always in the background, both informing and restricting sex workers' mutual relationships and their labor strategies. So, in the next few minutes, I will unpack Gertrudis' story and present to you the system of informal norms that she referenced. I will do that in 3 steps. First, I will introduce the street sex workers I met. Second, I will describe sex workers' informal hierarchies, their rights and duties, and enforcement mechanisms. And finally, I will conclude by inviting you to explore gender and political economy through ethnography, considering not only what the law commands, but also what it does in the real world. So first, the introduction. The street sex workers I met were cisgender and transgender women, all over the age of 18. None of them was subject to sex trafficking at the time I spoke with them. All these women were breadwinners, and their main concern and reason to wake up every morning was bringing home the bacon. At least in Mexico City, street sex workers have been informal workers since 2019, when street soliciting was formally decriminalized. But I must mention that the activism of organized sex workers and elite feminist scholars got street sex work de facto decriminalized since the early 2000s. That's all for an introduction. My second step is presenting you the hierarchies, the rights and duties and mechanisms of enforcement that constituted sex workers' informal social order. Do you remember Gertrudis' quote? She said, "As independent sex workers, we lack a union, a university, a leader, or someone who controls us." In this sentence, Gertrudis pointed to the internal differentiation and hierarchies among street sex workers. On the one hand, there are sex workers who, like Gertrudis, call themselves independent because they were self-employed and, as Gertrudis said, had no one controlling them at their workplace. Independent workers earned the right to stand on the street by enduring peer-to-peer mistreatment and physical violence upon arrival. That is the anecdote Gertrudis shared when I interviewed her. In contrast to independent sex workers, I found subordinate sex workers who paid a fee to street managers in exchange for permission to use the street. These street managers were capitalists, and like employers in other industries, they controlled their workers' schedules, dress codes, and fee payments, and appropriated their surplus value. In exchange for that, street managers absorbed the costs of security, and among other things, allowed newcomers to avoid the aggressive initiation they would otherwise endure if they wanted to become independent sex workers. Now, going back to Gertrudis' words, she said, "We have our own set of rules, and we set those rules." In this quote, Gertrudis was talking about informal social norms that form a whole system. But the truth is that informal norms among sex workers allocated different rights and duties depending on the hierarchies among them. For instance, there was an informal norm that said that once an independent sex worker earned her place in the street, or a subordinate worker paid for one, such a worker had the right to exclude others from her domains. In the case of subordinate workers, however, street managers had always the first and final say on how the street should be distributed, and it is because they occupied a higher position than subordinate workers. Correlative to the informal right to own territory, independent and subordinate workers had a duty not to trespass. Senior independent sex workers and street managers would enforce those rights whenever a dispute about space distribution arose. Of course, there were more than property rights and duties among street sex workers, but you will have to invite me to another panel if you want to know them all. For today, I chose property rights and duties as an example of informal endowments because informal ownership is indeed very interesting. For one thing, informal ownership created an issue for sex workers to bargain with and against each other, even in the absence of legal regulation of sex work. So you might, as lawyers, think, oh, if there is no right, legal right, there is no remedy. But it turns out that in the shadows of the legal order, there is normativity that is not legal and gives endowments for people to fight for resources. I will say more about this in a moment. For another thing, informal ownership created an interesting paradox for those interested in on the interaction between gender and the law. Such a paradox appears in Gertrudis' quote when she says, "One might say the street is free, but it is not." Liberal legal systems often rest on the assumption, pointed out by Yiran, that the family and the market are separate spheres, and that sexuality must remain in the private domain of the family. Accordingly, the notion persists that sex cannot be considered a job. In Mexico City, the effect of this legal construct is that sex workers have been denied legal property rights that other workers like mariachi singers, organ grinders, and street vendors have been able to claim from the state. However, the financial needs and moral obligations of many low-income women, including street sex workers, whose main concern, as I said, is supporting their loved ones, have blurred the boundaries between the family and the market. Informally, sex workers have populated the street and established individual property rights, simultaneously making the street a privatized informal market and integrating sex into the market. So, as Gertrudis said, the street finds itself no longer free to be used by the public, but informally privatized to be used as a sex market. There is yet one more aspect that I want to explore, the enforcement mechanisms of this informal social order, which can be inferred from Gertrudis' quote, "The rules must be respected." Sex workers used every tool they had to enforce their informal norms and bargain with each other, from gossip, verbal confrontations and manipulation, to physical force and legal accusations. This means that sex workers did use coercive tools against each other, but they also had norms in place to limit the severity of those moves. For example, healthy women were not allowed to fight against sick or disabled women, and transgender women were not permitted to engage in battle with cisgender women. And as a different example, the general practice was that after filing a complaint, charges would be dropped as soon as the offender stopped her wrongdoing. In other words, the point of resorting to the legal system was often not to get a conviction, but only to scare the shit out of the enemy. For instance, let us imagine that an independent sex worker and her parasitic partner wanted to colonize an already occupied street. In that case, the colonizing worker would often beat or threaten the owner of the land. The owner would often fight back against invaders by confronting them, beating them, or rather filing charges of sexual exploitation against both the invader and her partner, so that they try to escape arrest, leaving the aggrieved owner alone. So let me make this clear. Sexual exploitation was never meant to be used to fight for space. It was a tool to protect victims of sexual exploitation from traffickers. And yet, this was the paradoxical use sex workers were given to this crime on the ground. Likewise, if a street manager used cruelty and humiliation to exact her fees, subordinate workers could also file charges of sexual exploitation against her. To be sure, moves against parasitic partners and street managers were not common because of the fear of retaliation. But when they happened, the point was often to get the offender locked up in jail, not just to make him or her disappear temporarily. As Hila pointed out, workers vary in their levels of vulnerability and coercion. The rights and duties street sex workers got from their informal norms, in conjunction with many other factors, position these workers differently along the spectrum, which in turn explains why some did not fight back against problematic managers and co-workers, but others did. I do not think that the drafters of the international laws against sex trafficking and sexual exploitation or the Mexican representatives envisioned that sex workers in Mexico City would use the sexual exploitation crime against co-workers, street managers, and parasitic men to assert informal property rights on the street. I think legislators were mostly preoccupied with male domination and female subordination, and so on creating a super potent system that raised the level of convictions and destroyed the sex markets. But human existence is more complicated than that, I just showed you, and the sex markets do not seem close to disappearing anytime soon. Unlike lawmakers, the livelihoods of sex workers and their families hinge on the sex markets. Any ethnographer could see the real-life circumstances of these people, understand what change would mean to them, and perhaps hold on a bit before rushing to silver bullet solutions, or at least be transparent about the costs that such solutions would bear on different communities. Now I have reached the end of my presentation, and I hope that Gertrudis's words encourage you to dive into the hidden and often paradoxical worlds that exist in the shadows of the legal order. I hope this exploration becomes a useful approach for those curious about the complex analysis of gender and political economy. And thank you all.
Okay,
So just a quick note, we're gonna run until 1:30. So I think initially it was till 1:15, but if folks have
Shall
to
we
go at
pause?
some point.
shall we pause at 1:15 so people can leave if they
Sure.
have something else to do? Okay, thank you for the extra time. So, I have one other question, do the people raising their hands need to be given the mic?
No,
No.
no.
Okay, great, so we'll take, thank you all for your really interesting presentations. Before I go to Q&A, I wanna give you all a chance to talk to each other about what you heard in each other's presentations that corresponded with some aspect of what you were doing or that contradicted it. I can imagine the trafficking piece might spark a couple comments, but also I think there's some strong differences between the way Yiran structures her research and say the way Claudia did and the way Hila does, so there's also some differences to explore. And I just open it up to the three of you.
Is it open? Yes. So thank you. This was really interesting. From the perspective of trafficking and the human trafficking regime, legal regime, I think both of the types of workers you're thinking about, maybe not the family members so much, but the paid kind of Medicaid professionalized workers in some way, in Iran's case, and definitely the street sex workers in Claudia's case, are kind of classic victims of trafficking. We talk a lot about domestic slavery in the world of trafficking, and so that would be kind of Iran's category. And what I, again, from the narrow perspective of kind of looking at this from trafficking, it was very interesting to see the rich structures. For Iran, it's a lot of formal structures that drive what would be maybe recognized as exploitation in some context, and in Claudia's case, what would drive violence on the one hand, resistance to exploitation on another through informal norms. And I think the challenge of the trafficking regime is really to or of a labor approach to trafficking regime is to find where anchors of resistance, anchors of worker power and resistance to exploitation can lie. And I was wondering, my question to you is, from your perspectives, where do you think, if at all, that kind of the trafficking legal regime, the traditional one, a more labor approachy one, could help the workers that you are thinking about, if at all? I'll say that within the trafficking world, there is a real debate whether trafficking is a category that we should just get rid of because it does nothing to support and help workers. So that would be my question to you guys.
Okay, thanks, Hila, and thanks everyone. I think that you were right when you at the beginning said that we should focus less on the criminal law and more in labor law in order to regulate these markets. At least that holds true for the workers I met. I don't know if it would be different for other communities and groups, but for the workers I met, I do think that a labor approach would be useful, because I see that many of the regulations that are already out there available for other workers would benefit these women. However, it must be, I am not suggesting that we should just legalize sex work and put over a lot of regulation on them, because I think that at least for street sex workers who are low income workers, be completely included into the formal economy would not be a great idea. They would have to pay taxes, and that's something that they are very explicitly not wanting to do. But for instance, I know that several other workers that I mentioned, for instance, mariachi singers, organ grinders, street vendors, they are not employees, and still they have many labor or administrative benefits that are available to them. For instance, they have unemployment benefits available. They have ways to complain when there's retaliation going on, and those are not necessarily criminal laws. They are more administrative and labor. So I think that if we could expand the range of tools that are available for workers, for sex workers, to fight back against, in this case, street managers, who are the ones who are kind of exploiting them and extracting their surplus value, then that would be a way to go.
So thank you for the question. So when I was thinking of the spectrum vulnerability or the spectrum coercion in the case of the home care workers, whether they're family member or not, and there's always a murkiness that when you're working for somebody for 10 years, even if you just start as a family member, you're very family-like in some way. And I think that a lot of the coercion can come from the market or market rules, if you say abandon somebody, if somebody died or was hurt under your care, there is a punishment that's imposed by the state. But there is also a sense of coercion comes from the family, or just come from feeling bad about leaving this person alone, even if you don't have a legal duty to do it. And whether that as a force of and the individuals who are in that position very genuinely feel coerced by it. And even for family members, whether paid or unpaid, they felt that but they also felt a very sense of devastation, be put through this for years. So I think the source of coercion is not just a spectrum of degrees, but they're also coming from different sources. So how to conceptualize it through the traffic regime, I think would be a very interesting but also nuanced question. Yeah, thank you.
Any other panelists?
I mean, we could continue, but I think that we should allow people to, yeah.
Okay, in the baseball cap, and would you say your name?
Yeah, I'm Luis Flores. I'm a sociologist and a postdoc at the Kennedy School at the moment. So these are just such fascinating presentations. I have so many reflections and questions, but I have two brief questions, one for Yiran and one for Claudia. So for Yiran, your work really reminds me of Arlie Hochschild's book, The Managed Heart, that kind of generates the concept of emotional labor. And there it's air stewardesses who are being paid to perform these tasks and are not being paid for the kind of work of being happy, of being pleasant, of caring for mostly men. So she's making this distinction between tasks and this other kind of face work and emotional work of being pleasant. And so I'd be curious to hear you reflect a bit about beyond being tasks, what is the boundary around kinds of care that is being drawn by these laws? And to me, it sounds a bit like there's kind of a bodily kind of definition of some kinds of care that's about cleaning the body, using the bathroom, and then this other kind of care that maybe is less regular. There seems to be something about regularity and something about the body, and I'd be curious to hear you talk about what that distinction is doing to kinds of care. And then for Claudia, I'm really fascinated by this idea of the I think you called it the informal privatization of the streets or something like that, but I'm curious how the fact that the streets are not equally kind of useful or equally lucrative places for street sex work plays into this kind of informal regulation, that there are some sites that are presumably exposing you to more business, more commerce, safer commerce. So the kind of inequality in the streets as markets, how that plays into this kind of all the streets are not equal as sites of the street. So I'd be curious how that kind of plays into this informal regulation of places, of public space.
You want to take it away?
I can start, and thank you for the question. I think this task versus emotional labor or relational, what is left of care if you put tasks out? I think it's quite of what the question is getting at. So there are two dimensions to it. One is I was looking at the ALJ decision, see when the caregivers or the family members come in, say they should be recognized for more, or they want more payment for longer duration. What are they talking about? And a lot of time I find what they are arguing is care is presence, just somebody being there, and they see a lot of values just having another able-bodied person in that space, and that's not necessarily them doing anything, but that gives a strong sense of safety or sense of how we are maintaining this person. And I think that's not quite captured by how the medical definition of home care is now. But at the same time, my second layer of answer to this question is that which way to see care is a more preferred way is very contested. So you see the more the market actor kind of home care workers, they like this task list division of care. They want to say, I do A, B, C, and D, and that's it. I don't do everything. That there is a boundary. This is how I feel like a worker, not just your hired daughter. But you see the same pushback from the care recipient and care families that we want something that's more comprehensive. That's not a person. That's about the person, not just the body. So this is very much contested within these groups.
Well, when you say safer areas for commerce, the first thing that pops in my mind is the idea of more light, because that's how regulators often talk about we are going to make this safer by putting more light and more police. And that's definitely something that sex workers don't want. They don't want police, and then they don't want more light, because otherwise, like, their clients would just like fly away. Like, they don't want to be recognized, right? So that's not good for business. So if we call it safer, like, for them, it doesn't work. But that's not the key distinction to differentiate workers in the streets, at least not among these workers. Like, I saw that accessibility to main streets and closeness to hotels, those were kind of the key elements and the like more important assets that were at stake among sex workers. And it was often street managers who had been like sex workers for a long time and had already like built a network like in the streets, who often like own like these hot spots. I also noticed that, yeah, I mean, that's true, like the street is unequal. Those streets that were like populated by independent sex workers, like those streets, they fought for, and they used like several legal tools, even though they were informal sex workers. For instance, they started to put like complaints, like human rights complaints against police officers who wanted to remove them from the street when neighbors complained about their presence. So that's how they started to resist and to claim the right to be on the street, even though they like sex work was nowhere regulated. And pretty recently, kind of, and I think it was 2014, like they filed an amparo, which is quite a like a legal resource when you claim that there was a state violation of your rights, like you put an amparo, and they got it, and they were allowed to like get a credential as a self-employed worker, and that's how they started to demand the police to allow them to stay in the street, for instance. So when I think it's true, like the street as it is right now is unequal, if we wanted to, and I am not saying that we should, but if we wanted to change those like inequalities, power inequalities right now, we could like make some ticks and tags and some like changes to the rules as they are now. There are some available. I don't think that we need regulation of sex work. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, okay.
Other hands? Yes, in your name, please.
Hi, I'm Shannoy. I'm an SJD student here. To see you both back, and hi to you. I guess the question is for Hila and Yiran in this way. That is that I think we could start with the agreement that conditions of capitalism will always persist with an excess of some kind, whether we want to call it primitive accumulation or whatnot. This is a sort of given condition of capitalism. Somebody has to be slightly just outside and has to be sort of, coerced in terrible ways that, that the sort of ordinary legal order doesn't allow. But what's interesting, of course, about this work is that it says that, well, that excess cannot simply be called primitive accumulation, which is sort of ontologically dependent on understanding gender. Or I think at least that's the theoretical thrust here, but perhaps I couldn't catch it so much in the presentation. So the invitation here is to sort of to say that if somebody says primitive accumulation, you would have to say, no, that's not enough. I want to say a little bit more. And that has to be sort of gender is ontologically central to this. So in what way, I guess, is the question. So if both of you could just reflect on that.
So I think for me, the answer would be no, gender is actually not that central to this. And it is central to misunderstanding of it in some way, and not necessarily to what I understand as effective tools to address these problems. And so I think I would be actually, I would not use, I would not turn to primitive accumulation myself, just because it just assumes too much about the structure of capitalism. But my problem with it won't be, oh, it's not enough about gender. I think gender definitely causes a vulnerability. Many different things cause vulnerability, and gender is one of them. And in the different axes, in order to understand positions of vulnerability, we need to address gender as well. But gender is not alone in causing it. At least that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, so one way I think about this is the standard of care. Like, if you presume that capitalism just need to minimize what's needed for nonprofit making activities, then you can just house everybody in nursing homes. But the reason we have this entire industry, this economy rising, is that there is social contestations that, okay, putting people in nursing home is not enough. And so I think there is, I would not say indeterminacy, but I think there's something that's not captured by why we're doing this the way we do it. Even if there are layers of exploitation that's very much just market exploitation, that some of labor, especially women's labor, like especially women's work inside families, probably marginalized and undervalued. I think that is true, but it also doesn't determine exactly the way how we do it in the way we do it.
I have a question. Oh, Claudia, do you wanna take that up?
No.
I have a question about how your market works with the brokers. I had to look over my shoulder to see, but it looked like the Medicaid workers were being paid $22 an hour. I've been in the market for home health care recently because of a friend's needs, twice in the last couple of years, and it's $48, mandatory 6-hour shift. And from the brokers that I approach is somebody assuming the family's gonna pay. You know, so there may be something about the ones that work through the Medicaid program. And I assume they're gonna get about 15 or 18 or minimum wage, or, you know, that so much is gonna go to the broker. So in a way, your subsidy program is subsidizing a brokerage system as much as it's subsidizing a care system. And so I wonder whether it's worth pausing to think about that as a form of exploitation, a form of capturing surplus value, a form of distributing it in classic Marxist senses, that could be better controlled. Some of you people in this room are in my family law of poor families class, and we've been reading Evicted, and there's a broker there who acts as middleman between super low income renters and super substandard housing. And she captures about a third of their government benefits just by putting them in touch with housing that has no running water, no heat, no appliances, you know. So I mean, when government money gets loose, there's vultures, right? So I wonder if you can say anything about that later.
I think one thing is more systematic structure or common across poor law, that more money is put into people who manage poor people rather than ending up in poor people's hands. I think there is a dimension to it, and it's also like the managed care plan lens is like one more broker that was introduced in the system as part of the reform in the last 10 or 15 years, which is seeing a way that this can help us to cut costs. But indeed it just monitor fraud, and marketization is a way to reduce Medicaid spending, all that. And there I think there are good questions to ask, like what added value do they bring to the system, and what surplus do they really extract from the system?
So other
Let's
hands?
do a lightning round of 3.
We have several, okay, there you are.
This is a really good question. It's for Claudia. You said that the sex workers you interviewed said that they don't have a union, and so I was wondering if they said something about how they feel about unionization, or if that's something they considered similar to other informal workers on the streets, because I think a lot of informal workers in India, like rickshaw drivers, they're unionized and they're a part of the informal economy.
So Sanjay suggested lightning rounds, but I only saw the one hand.
No, there were many hands.
Okay, other hands, yes.
I just, you did a differentiation between task and emotional sort of work, and I just wonder whether, and you said that there is a tension, that some people are actually pushing to connect them and some people are pushing to widen them, and I wondered about the question of exploitation, so whether the task is actually a good way to prevent exploitation. So I would also be happy to hear from Hila about this point, like whether this task list that they are against, is it actually a good thing to have?
And where is the other hand? Yes, Donna.
Yes, my question kind of continues, Professor Halley, to Iran. I think part of the power of the basic feminist claim about social reproduction work at home was mainly with regard to children, was that the mom raises the children and then the capitalists take and consume them without the mom having the ability to consume what she produced, right? Now, this might sound provocative, and this is not the intention, just to think, how can you articulate a similar claim not based on moral groundings with regard to non-productive people, mainly old people or people that can't enter the workforce? Or are you willing to say that the whole claim is just based on moral obligations towards these people?
So, great.
There was one over here.
Oh,
Ori,
thanks. It's like to Claudia, kind of follow up on the unionization question. You mentioned several instances of litigation, workers went to court, and in a sense, that's a form of unionization, right? Because there is a class effect to litigation. Once a court says something, that kind of impacts the way the whole relevant market then behaves. So I was wondering to what extent are these moves kind of agreed upon or coordinated, or can one person just go to court and then somehow affect the relevant class, and how the politics of that is
good questions.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I can go first. Well, so I think that unions, as we understand them here in the US, I think that there is some more active movement in favor of unionization in places like India and Argentina, but not much in Mexico City. And the stated reason that sex workers gave me on why they didn't want to unionize is first that they didn't trust each other. Like they thought that unionization would mean that some of them would be able to get money, and there was no way for them to ensure that that money would be actually used for the benefit of all the union members. And that's their experience, because that's how it has worked with nonprofits in Mexico City. Like that's the experience of sex workers. It's like they are getting the money, they are using our stories to get that money, and in the end, like we are not, and it makes sense because that money ultimately pays wages for like the staff member of the organization. It doesn't necessarily go straight to the workers, which is kind of the point that Janet was making about the brokers, right? So we, like the state system, how it works now, it's through intermediaries, and like that has its upsides and downsides. In this case, like sex workers are not super excited about unionization because of that, because they cannot ensure that the money that they would receive would be, well, money and other resources would be equally distributed among them. And also it's about time. They don't think that they have the time to engage in politics, and they would prefer to use their time in working more or spending time with their families instead of like being out there like organizing. And they have, for that same reason, deferred to the action of nonprofits and on their leave to do litigation and other kinds of work. Like actually the litigation I was referring to, it was started by an organization, and only some sex workers were included in the amparo. Like ultimately, the organization itself tried to spread the word, like have like more workers like join the cause, but still like it took time and it was not equal anyway. Yeah, 1 minute.
So Sanjay, do your programs go over or do you stop
Just,
on time?
no, I mean, just
Okay,
a minute,
then
90 seconds each,
Yiran,
yeah.
you're
Yeah, you're
quickly
right.
on the task.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think there are two layers of it. Task list can be a tool against exploitation between the worker and the person who or the family member who's on the side and demand them doing more. But task list can be used as a tool of exploitation by the state to only pay for some of what actually they have to do anyway. So there are I think that's two dimensions of both there. And so that's on the what's the value of what is happening here? I think this is where actually I hit the limitation of what we think of as social reproduction. When I was in my previous project, when I was studying childcare, there's a lot of quality of childcare, human capital, investment, next generation of workforce. There's a very you can see what value capitalism can actually get from it, but by having better care for individuals with disabilities who are not in the workforce, who will never be in the workforce, or people who are post their workforce period. This is where I don't know how social reproduction, value generation will say about it.
Oh, God. That was horrible to hear. Donna, with all my gray hair, that felt personal. Donna?
I'm sorry?
Oh, no, Donna's question. Who was
Yeah.
Donna's question about children and children as
Well,
the,
just let's finish with some concluding thoughts from Hila as the sort of last.
Sorry.
Yeah, we are
Yeah.
on overtime.
go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just say quickly that I think the question of tasks is, the default task is really about a kind of the trope of professionalization. It's not always a trope, sometimes it's a real thing, but I think a lot of the informal economy workers and what's called unskilled workers search for professionalization, and it's, as Yiran said, it's a double-edged sword because it can then include some and exclude some. And I think when thinking about, I'll just end maybe with saying something about the value question. I think in theories of life cycle in the labor market, the assumption is that the worker paid off, by working previously. So would not work for the disabled. I think that still would be a challenge. But that this is something now that it's almost like care work, but from the other side, we kind of assume that the way the labor market works should include the time of care at the beginning of life and at the end of life. And so that comes into pensions, and when we think about increased wages, even though even when efficiency is not increased, this all is supposed to somehow compensate for that. So there is in the literature of industrial relations in the labor market, there is kind of an answer of where the value is, and it's usually in production before, being the productive period. That's just a thought of how to conceptualize.
That was
Thank you very
great.
much.
Okay, I
everybody.
want to thank panelists, thank everybody. Thank Sanjay for
Thank you.
this opportunity.
Thank you all for